Welcome back, friends. Now that we have looked at different financing and marketing strategies in public transportation, and also in the previous lectures we have covered a lot about bus public transportation system. Now let us introduce you to the topic of urban rail transportation. So in this type of in this lecture we will look at the different types of rail transportation, and especially we are focusing on urban rail transportation. We will look at a little bit about the suburban rails, and then start looking about the mass rapid transit systems of metros, light rail, and as well as give you an overview about what is monorail, how can they be planned for, what are their capacities, and so on and so forth, right. So, in India, when we talk about urban rail transport, we are usually talking about either suburban commuter rails, which are available in some of the large metropolitan cities, or talking about rapid rail transit, or which we call otherwise called metro rail. We are also talking about light rail transit in India. Not many cities have it, but we are now planning for light rail transit in some of the cities, and also monorail systems, which exists only in one of the city in India, but will give you an idea about what monorail systems are and how and what are their capacities and how they can be planned for. So, suburban rails are something that has been there for a long period of time in India. They are primarily there in all the four large metropolitan cities, and now they are coming up in a couple more cities as well. The main objective of suburban rail is to help people settle in the suburban locations, right. So, as the city started expanding, people started living further and further away. So, in order to connect all of these suburban areas, right, to the city, it was envisioned that there should be specific rail systems for everyday commuters. We already have intercity rail transport, but those are for longer distances of travel, whereas if you are within an hour or an hour and a half or even 2 hours, sometimes beyond that too, which becomes even more tiring, but ideally around 2 hours away, you are usually connected by some sort of a suburban rail transport system. First one, of course, was built way back in 1838 for London. Currently, suburban rail has a lot of issues in India, especially centering around overcrowding, because of the lack of any other mode of reliable transport from these large suburban areas. The rail systems is almost always overcrowded. A very popular picture that you often see are the overcrowded suburban rails of Mumbai, which face a lot of safety issues as well, concerns during flooding, concerns during peak hours of travels, and so on and so forth. So, suburban rails, although have a very high capacity of around 20,000 to 40,000 passengers per hour in each direction, but due to the amount of or due to the frequency of the rails, or due to the number of trains that can be run on each line, they almost always face a lot of overcrowding. So, in order to modernize, or in order to improve the quality of provided by rail transportation, people have now started to look at metro rail systems across different cities, right. Metro rail systems are rail systems that can travel faster. They can attain a higher speed than suburban rail systems, and in doing so, it can then transport more number of people per hour per direction, right. So, metro rail systems have been developed. The first one in India was developed in Kolkata, and now we have several metro rail systems in India in multiple cities, and the network is also very well developed. For example, the New Delhi Metro Rail network is one of the most widely reached or widely reaching network in the country. There are specific systems or subsystems within the metro rail, the larger metro rail system. It has to have separate stations. It cannot have the same stations as the suburban rail. The signaling systems are much more efficient. It has specialized fare collection systems that have been introduced, and also the boarding and alighting facilities are controlled through automated doors. Right, the capacity, now remember, the suburban rail capacity was somewhere between 20,000 to 40,000 passengers per hour per direction, whereas this can go up to in peak hours, metro rail can take up to 60,000 passengers per hour. From the cost and economy considerations, planners recommend that once your population of your city grows anywhere beyond 2 millions, you should start thinking about rapid rail transit or metro rails. Right now, this is one of the main drivers of public transportation is the population and also the population density. If you don't have enough population density in your city, it becomes challenging to efficiently or financially efficiently operate your mass rapid transit systems. So, if you, especially if you see larger cities that are sprawled out in across the world, they cannot sustain a mass rapid transit system just because of their population density. So, if you have sprawled out cities with lower densities, mass metro rail systems becomes inefficient, whereas if you have dense high population density, which is the case with most of our urban areas, metro rail does become very viable. However, you have to have certain thresholds because these involve construction of metro rail is usually very expensive, and so to make it viable, financially viable, you have to have certain amount of ridership that can be attracted. It has also been seen that if in your city the average length of each of the trips that your citizens take is around 7 to 8 kilometers, only then metro rail can be really beneficial, right. So, if your people are traveling for longer distances, then metro rail can help reduce the travel time between these distances and so attract more and more people to your system. Whereas, if you have a city where travel distances are already very short, metro rail cannot be of much help. So, that is another very important point that you have to keep in mind. And then you have to design the metro rail system in such a way that any traffic greater than 20,000 peak hour peak direction, right. If there is more than 20,000 people that are traveling in the peak hour in the peak direction, then metro becomes really beneficial. So, it is not only the per hour ridership that you have to be worried about, but it is the peak hour peak direction ridership is kind of a metric or a benchmark that people look at the existing system when they try to start planning for metro rail. So, 3 important things to remember: population size, the average trip length in your cities, and also the peak hour peak direction traffic. Now, metro rail systems, as you may already know, can be either above ground or also below ground. The costs vary significantly, but that is a call that has to be taken by your local administration or the agency that is constructing the metro. There are pros and cons for both of them. Although the elevated structures cost less when compared to digging underground tunnels where the metro would run, but people are averse to overground structures because they might create a lot of noise, and also visually they may not be very appealing for any city to have a lot of lines running on top of them. Just like we do not like the overhead wires, overhead electric wires hanging around on top of us. Similarly, many cities have made this observation that if a metro system is to be built, it has to be put underground, but then underground systems are very expensive. So, if you just if you want a ballpark figure, you can say that the cost of elevated track is likely to be over 5 times than that of just a surface track, right. But very few metro stations are ad grade, very few metro systems are ad grade. Most of them are either above grade or below the surface. But if you were to compare it for example, a suburban rail which runs at grade, so a metro rail would almost cost 5 times, elevated metro rail would almost cost 5 times. Given here is an example of prices which were looked at back in 2007 when Chennai Rapid Rail or Chennai Metro was being envisioned. You could see the cost per kilometer in 2000. These are all 2007 numbers. So, if you were to have it at surface, it would be 40 million rupees per kilometer, whereas if you had to put it underground, it would be almost 900 million. So, that is a huge cost. So, especially keeping in mind the huge costs in the metro rails, usually what many planning authorities or agencies do is to have alternative assessments of whether a light rail, for example, a light rail transit system can be more cost effective when compared to a metro rail, or could a BRTS be more cost effective when compared to a metro rail. So, always there is an alternative available just because of the prohibitive nature of the cost involved in building metro rail systems. So, this is an example of an underground tunnel that has to be constructed in order to have metro rail lines underground. Kolkata's a large section of Kolkata's first metro line was underground. Most of it actually was underground. However, now the extensions are all mostly overground, apart from a small stretch which is now going to go under the river Hooghly to connect to the Howrah rail station, which is again underground. So, the underground construction costs include the cost will include not only traffic dislocation, but diversion of other underground services, electric supply, water supply. So, just relocation of utilities also takes a lot of cost when you are trying to put something underground. We have already talked about the implications of overground metro rail systems, where it may create noise and not a great visual. A typical cross section of an elevated metro rail system and a ad grade metro rail system are shown here. So, you see that at least you have to have for a metro rail system, you have to have enough space for 2 lines up and a down, and also at a station. So, this is a cross section of a metro rail station at grade. You have to have a concourse level as well, and have all the other amenities such as lifts and stairs that take you on and off a metro rail. Now, coming to the next type of urban public transportation system, which is called light rail. Now, many of you may have seen light rail systems from across the world. In India, we do not have a fully operating light rail system. What we have is a tram system in Kolkata, which is very similar to a light rail system, but however, they do not have are not segregated from other traffic, right. They do not have a dedicated right of way. So, that is the only difference between a light rail system and an LRT and a tram system, where trams mix with other kinds of traffic, whereas LRT is generally segregated from other traffic. Both of them are built at grade, right. LRT usually uses lighter vehicles, so the costs are much lesser than a metro rail system, and being at grade also helps in reducing the cost. Unlike popular perception that they may take or carry fewer number of passengers, it is not so. LRT is also recommended when traffic is around 20,000, but less than it in peak hour, peak direction traffic, and can be planned at a threshold of 1 million population itself, and the same average trip length of 7 to 8 kilometers that was used for metro rail system can also justify putting in a light rail system. The only objection several times people have is they feel that light rail systems may intermingle with other modes, just as it's shown here, and hence they may be delayed. But usually it is not the case. It is already, although it is at grade, but it does have some kind of dedicated right of way where cars and other traffic cannot mingle with it, unlike tram systems which have no dedicated right of way. So again, shown here are alternate types of LRT systems that you can also have. Some do have underground and overground LRT systems, but usually again due to cost, those are not preferred. They are usually at grade, where they are separated at ground level, and when they are shared with roads, although they are shared with roads, but you see there is some kind of separation between themselves and the traffic. This chart shows you the different capacities when you compare between bus rapid transit, an LRT, and a subway, usually meaning some kind of a metro rail system. So you see the capacities. Metro can carry a very large capacity, followed by LRT and followed by bus. So when you are trying to plan for your city, you first have to know those three parameters as to what is the population density of your city, or what is the average trip length, and also how many people are traveling in the peak hour in a peak direction, right. If you know all of these three, then you can make an estimate as to how many people can any of the proposed three systems carry, and which would be a more viable system for your city. In congested CBD areas especially, LRT can be operated in tunnels. However, in lower density suburban areas, it can be on existing median roads. Again, tunnels do increase the cost, but there are instances where they are in tunnels. If you broadly, if you wanted to see where the costs of these of the LRT systems fall, you could say that the LRT system is cost is more than a bus rapid system, but less than a metro rail system. Finally, if you talk about another type of public transportation system, that would be monorails. Monorail comprises of a single rail serving as a guideway with vehicles suspended from or straddling the guideway. So, these are systems that have not become very popular across the world, but are available at certain locations within cities. The major advantage is that it requires a smaller structure, right. It does not require as large a structure as is required for a metro system, and hence the cost of constructing the infrastructure and also the maintenance cost is lower. But at the same time, it can also carry fewer number of passengers, right. So, when you already have an overcrowded public transportation system and you want to enhance it, usually people do not go for a monorail system because they cannot carry too many people. However, monorail systems are very popular, especially at concentrated high intensity use areas, right. So, for example, you may have a large airport system and you may want multiple terminals, and you may want to connect multiple terminals. So, in those cases, many times, sometimes you have a form of monorail, which we'll talk about what form that is. But at such concentrated locations for shorter duration trips, where the demand for or the passenger demand is no higher than 10,000 to 20,000 per hour per direction, that is a situation where you can use the monorail systems. There are different types of monorail systems. PRT is something that is being tried at many of the airport locations that I was talking about recently, where to connect between two terminals. Maglev has been used in the past, but is mostly used for intercity kind of transport. And there is the most popular type is the straddle type or the suspended type. So, you would either see a monorail suspended from a tower or from a structure, or it is straddling on top of a structure. So, that is the two different types of monorail systems that are very popular. The last slide here is to give you an overview of a snapshot of what are some of the proposed MRTS guidelines by the government of India. Like we have already discussed, when it comes to metro rail, you have to ensure that the criteria of peak hour, peak direction traffic is met on the proposed corridor, and usually what is being proposed as a guideline is if you can project that there will be more than 20,000 people traveling in the peak hour in the peak direction by the year 2030, then you can start planning for a metro rail for your city. It also has to meet the criteria of having more than 2 million people as per the 2001 census, and also your average trip length should be more than 7 to 8 kilometers. So, a city where your average trip lengths are much shorter, metro rail would not be very helpful. If you take the other extreme and are trying to plan for monorail, then you would see that less than 20,000, if there are less than 20,000 by 2031, you can try it. A population could be more than 2 million, but your average trip length has to be much shorter trips, then you can plan for monorail, and whereas something in between is LRT, and the criteria again are given here. So, this gives you kind of a snapshot of the different types of urban rail transportation systems that you can choose from for your city these are at a guidelines are at a very policy level, and then you have to do your analysis to find out which fits your city. So, that brings us to the conclusion of an overview of the urban rail transport systems, where we have now looked at the different types of rail transport systems, including the suburban, metro rail, monorail, as well as the LRT systems. We have looked at what are the criteria they have to fulfill before you plan for each of the systems. We have briefly looked at how they can be designed, overground or underground, and the costs involved in each of those designs should also be kept in mind when you are planning for each of these systems. Some of the references that for further reading that you can use. Thank you very much for your attention.